All right. Again, thank you so much for being here. I'm Shannon Harden. I have the honor of being the co-chair of the Insight2050 Corridor Study. We are really excited about the conversation that we're going to have this evening. And really, the truth of it is that this is the beginning of a long conversation. Big picture, everybody in this room knows that this region is going to grow. We know that we're going to add 500,000 to 1 million people over the next 25 to 30 years. So that question now has been answered. Are we going to grow? Yes. The answer is yes. The unanswered question, though, is how are we going to grow? And what are the impacts of us planning or not planning? What impact will that have on our region? Will that save us money? Will that make us a healthier community? Will that help us solve some of our bigger issues like affordable housing? What will that city look like if we do what other cities have yet done, what Nashville did not do, what Austin did not do? But what if we planned? What if we focused our growth in the right way along corridors? What would that look like? That's the conversation that we're going to have this evening. And at the end of the conversation, we are going to really ask you to become ambassadors, because this is now not a question. We don't have a real option if we want to do this right. If we really want to be the city that we talk about, we want to be the opportunity city. If we want to make sure that Columbus's growth is good for everyone, we really don't have an option, which means that we will have to stack hands. We will have to do the harder things, which are looking at our zoning policies. They're looking at and getting comfortable with words like density, which will be things like figuring out how we do transit right in Columbus. And so that is the very, very important conversation that we are bringing here this evening. We have rolled out the report earlier this morning at a luncheon. It was funny because I said that it was like nerd prom at the lunch, and guess what? The nerds didn't laugh. And so I realized it was true. So no, but we're really excited about this conversation. I want to recognize my colleague on council, Councilmember Shayla Favors. Councilmember, would you stand up and be recognized? And then we will be joined very shortly with an amazing panel of folks who have helped us move this conversation along. But before we get started, I want to bring up Ms. Shireen Kanuja, who's Vice President for Business Development here at Root Insurance. Would you please welcome her to say a few words?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. We are very excited to welcome you here today. I saw the words growth and mobility up on the screen, and those are two very important words here at Root. For just context, Root has grown year over year from 100 people to over 500 people. And we're very focused on the future of mobility. For a little bit more background on what Root does, so we do auto insurance, and we use the telematics from your phone to give you a score based on how you drive. And so that's where we're putting the real emphasis, is figuring out how you drive and placing the appropriate risk based on that, and we're able to give pretty substantial discounts to a lot of our customers. So we're based in Columbus, growing really rapidly in Columbus, and excited about this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shireen, and thank you again for hosting us. Let's see what the rest of my job is this evening. So, yeah, so like I said, this is a conversation of growth, and I think that it's really appropriate that we're here at Root, whose story so far has been one of amazing growth. And one of the conversations we had earlier today is that, cities are incentivized to create jobs and bring people to work in a community. But if we're not creating the housing to actually keep up with the job growth, then we are just exacerbating our affordable housing issue because of just the supply and demand of the issue. And so, again, this is a unique conversation. It's how do we get in front of a crisis? And so one of the people who has helped us and is a master of planning and coordinating for communities is Ms. Alicia Gaston, Executive Director here of Columbus Urban Land Institute. And I'd like to invite her up to the podium.
Thank you, President Harden. I'm Alicia Gaston. I'm the director of the Urban Land Institute here in Columbus. And the Urban Land Institute is a nonprofit research and education institute in the real estate and land use community for anyone who's not familiar with us. But we have a district council here in Columbus, and we've been part of a lot of discussions with our friends at MORPC who are here tonight, and the City of Columbus, Columbus 2020, and CODA, and the Columbus Partnership on growth discussions, because we really ignited conversations back in 2013 that we really need to start thinking about how and where we grow as a region. And just to reiterate some of the things that Council President Hardin said, we started these conversations because it's all about the study, and what you'll hear today is about building communities that will withstand the test of time, and building for people and building in harmony with the environment, not in spite of it. So we thank you for being here tonight and being part of this conversation, and we look forward to more. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. At this point, I'd like to ask Joe from Urban Footprint to join me at the podium. Joe is principal and co-founder of Urban Footprint. He has more than 20 years of experience in land use and transportation. His career has focused on the implementation of actionable, data-driven tools that bring critical information to environmental, public health, and social equity challenges. We'll now hear a 15-minute-ish presentation from Joe about the findings of the Insight2050 corridor concepts. Joe, welcome.
I think that might have been a hint based on some previously long-winded presentations today. Thank you, everybody, for being here. As someone from the San Francisco Bay Area that now runs a technology company, I will point out that it's places like this, honestly, that companies like ours are considering growing our workforce. And it's in part because of the forward-thinking nature of this region, and frankly, the project that we've been involved with now for almost 10 years. The ability to sort of get out in front, think about what this community wants to be, how it's going to address the challenges that it will face, as opposed to being crisis-driven. In the Bay Area, we have added 550,000 jobs in the last 10 years. We're an economic superpower. We've added 50,000, 60,000 housing units during that same period of time. The average home price in the Bay Area is $1.5 million. In Palo Alto, it's $3.1 million. Companies like ours can't afford to continue to grow in that place. People are leaving that place, and they're coming to places like this, which are getting out ahead of the curve and starting to think about what does the next generation need, let alone the current generation? How are we going to, age? And we're becoming older and younger as communities. And we're much more diverse than we were 30, 40, 50 years ago. Yet we are building as if it was 50 years ago, for the most part, in most parts of the country. I think what is so amazing about having been involved in this project in this region is the extent to which there is energy around getting ahead of the problems. Right, so Councilman Hardin noted Austin and Nashville and these other places, which are sort of crisis-driven now. We spent a lot of time working in Austin, rapidly growing place, Salt Lake City, fastest growing place in the Union when we were working there. And they were toiling with dramatic challenges around affordability, congestion, pollution. And I'm not saying those issues do not exist here, they do. But you are getting out ahead of them becoming crisis, and I think that's critical. It's something to be applauded, and it's relatively unique. I have worked across the world, across the country, and this is honestly the first place I have worked that was not crisis-driven when it comes to thinking about substantial shifts in patterns of growth and patterns of mobility, and in just patterns of community in general. So it's been exciting to be here working for the last number of years to get to know this place. And I probably already used 4 of my 15 minutes, so I'm just going to get into it. So this is Smart City USA. You're the federally designated smart city. There's lots of talk about future mobility, technology, everything from hyperloops, and obviously everyone is talking about AV and driverless cars, clean energy at scale, certainly a big deal in California and increasingly across the country, IoT, right? Zeros and ones passing through our bodies, being delivered by our refrigerators to some central command center, which then does something else, and then Amazon delivers you orange juice. Like all of this stuff, right? It's amazing. But I think that one of the things that we lose focus on sometimes is the cold, hard, like what works, our feet, community, right? So we lose track of what is important and enduring. What we build today is going to be here for 50 to 100 years. What we built 50 to 100 years ago is still here today for the most part, except for the crappy thrown up malls that are falling down. But honestly, we have to be really thinking about what works, what is enduring, and what is going to future-proof this region, no matter what technology ends up moving us from place A to place B. That is changing like sand beneath our feet. And we need to be thinking about the shape of community and investing in communities and investing in right-of-way, which is a lot about what this project is about. It's technical. ROW, right-of-way, is very important when it comes to the armature or the foundation for this place. So we know what works in many cases. We started doing it in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s with the streetcar suburbs. This is a modern version of the streetcar suburb in the Portland Pearl District. And I'm not supposed to mention Portland in most places other than Portland. But that is a relatively successful place. It's pretty nice and it's urban. But for the most part, we have disintermediated the human being, or we have designed the walk trip out of our environment, right? So this is a place, I won't name it, you know what it is. And it has all the mix of uses that we talk about when we talk about mixed use, but it is decidedly a non-walkable place. And so even the shortest trips need to be taken in vehicles. They're not safe to take in any other way, and they're not convenient to take in any other way. And I'm not saying that is not part of the future at all. I'm just saying that there are other ways for us to think about community. And this is an opportunity to think about whether we want to grow like this or we want to grow in other ways that are maybe more focused on a more balanced, if you will, approach to mobility and community. And I will say, right off the bat that this project is not, nor is growth about a one-size-fits-all approach. It is about increasing choice, addressing diversity, and being able to, frankly, attract and accelerate, potentially, economic growth because you're in a position to meet the demands of changing demographics and a changing landscape at scale and at pace. And frankly, existing established regions like the Bay Area and others are having a very difficult time doing that at pace. We are decades behind, companies like ours are coming in your direction in part because of that. And so I think that's an exciting opportunity. So I will move very quickly through the Insight2050 process itself. And there's a big report that gets into all the details. But at its core, it's really a question, I think, as the councilman already pointed out, how can we shape growth that supports strong, healthy communities? Not just about mobility. There's obviously mobility is the theme behind this, but mobility is a armature or a foundation for community, or it certainly can be. And so it's really beginning to think about that and think about it very seriously. So we talk about these 5 corridors. These are the 5 corridors that have been identified: Northwest, Northeast, East Main, Southeast, and West Broad. I do want to point out that these are 5 corridors that we utilized for this study and that came from lots of work in other studies, and we had to be constrained somehow. We can't look at everything all the time. This is not to say that other corridors may not be appropriate for concentrating or compact growth in the region. But this project was really meant to understand the impact of growing in a corridor kind of more compact fashion, and to begin to understand that. And that does not preclude other places from also being focal points for growth. So just on the whole, already kind of going over this. So what if we do focus growth around these corridors? That's a big question. What will Central Ohio be like? Is it something different than we know today? And how does it perform? What are the impacts of that? What if we don't do that? What if we continue to grow like we do, or we grow in an entirely different direction? That's what this project is all about. This is SimCity for real. That's my job. It's super fun. And we've built software, actually, SimCity for Real Urban Footprint, which facilitates getting that done at pace. We're looking forward to more people in this region using it to answer the kinds of questions that we're answering in this study, but to be able to do that at scale and at pace and have almost every conversation about development and transit and choices be injected with facts. In this world where it seems like sometimes facts don't matter, they actually do, and they should have an impact on the kinds of decisions that we're making. So speaking of facts, let me run through a couple of them before we get into the scenarios themselves. This is a place that is growing. We know this. When we started the Insight2050 process in 2013, I believe, we've consolidated on that date, the region was slated to grow by about 500,000 people by 2050. That number in a very short period of time has roughly doubled to about 1 million, about 400,000 plus new homes, 600,000 plus new jobs. Whether it occurs in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, or 50 years is really not the point here. The point is we need to plan for it, and we need to think about the impacts of how we accommodate that growth. But what's also very important is the region is changing. This is a demographic shift we're seeing across the country, but for the most part, we are getting older and younger. And yet, for the most part, the development inertia has still been to grow as we have been. And if you look at 2030 to 2050, this is supposed to be like a millennial event. The millennials are dominating in growth. Congratulations. And the next version of you is going to continue to grow as well. I feel sad that I can't say that I'm part of that group anymore. And this is, the household dynamics as we cross through different cycles of life also change. So if you look at where the growth is going to occur, the vast majority of growth is in households without children and singles living alone. So it is important to think about the housing stock that they need, that we all need as we move through different cycles of life. Like, why do we have to change communities or leave cities when we move from one age group to another? So this is about potentially like aging in place, growing in place, which is good. And so we know now, survey after survey after survey, the preference is for walkable, mixed-use places with a there. And a lot of what we're doing here is testing scenarios that capture that market demand, right? So demographic shifts, preference shifts. What if we met that demand? What would the impacts of that be versus another approach? So we've talked about this a lot. Mobility is changing. When we started the Insight2050 process, Lyft and Uber did not exist for the most part. No one took a Lyft or Uber ride. And now it has dramatically changed the way we think about transportation. We are moving from this world in which ownership is the model to usership is the model. If you haven't heard the term MaaS, mobility as a service, get used to it. That is what all automobile companies are becoming. That is what Lyft and Uber are. They are providing a service. And for the most part, when you survey a millennial, they don't want a car. They'd rather have a cell phone. They don't need a vehicle. So that doesn't mean that other people who didn't clap can't keep their vehicles, right? It just means that things are changing and there is choice in the future. It's like most people didn't clap. Anyway, so let me get into it really quickly. So the big question, how much growth can new mobilities accommodate? But most importantly, how much growth should they accommodate, right? So this is a data-driven exercise. It's also a preference and community-driven exercise. And this is just the beginning. It's going to get harder as you peel back the onion and figure out how to actually get this done. I can tell you how to get it done as a planner and from a computer's perspective, but it's really community decisions, it's zoning decisions, it's political decisions, and that's really where it has to go next. So we utilized our platform, Urban Footprint, to do sort of deep data-driven dives, interrogate the region from a data perspective to understand what's redevelopable, where development could occur, where transit systems are viable from a right-of-way perspective. But really, it was a combination of that data-driven perspective and stakeholder engagement. So there was community corridor-level working groups with residents and stakeholders, project-level working groups over a period of 9 months to a year. We got lots of information, lots of input. Scenarios emerged from that look at different ways to accommodate growth, all the way down to we accept that this much growth should be in the corridor, but then it's like, where should it occur? It could occur here, but should it occur here? And so people went through an exercise there. At a very high level, these get down to the detail, and the reports go down to each corridor. We're looking at a couple different scenarios in the end. One is what if we continue to do if we do what we have been doing, current trajectory. So it picks up some market trends, but it, for the most part, places new growth, those new million people, the 420,000 households, outside of the corridor. So about 20%, 18% are accommodated in the corridors, 40% of jobs. And you can see the pink here is just, it's hard to see up there, it's just development, and the darker the pink, the more intensity. It's just meant to be like a squint view of the world. The most important thing is the difference between these two. So now we looked at a corridor-focused scenario, which we reasonably think the corridors could easily accommodate 55% of jobs, about 55% of households, and about 60% of jobs. So as you look between these two, you can see the shape of the region sort of becoming more compact. There is still development occurring outside of the corridors, substantial amounts actually, but a dominant portion of the corridor is occurring, of the development is occurring on the corridors. Let's just do a quick blitz into one of them. I can't go through them all, but let's look at East Main. Here into the downtown zone. So just very quickly looking at what happens, those of you planners and designers in the room, land use colors, looking at intensification of East Main, mixed-use development, commercial development, residential development of different shapes and sizes, overall taking on about another 44,000 units within the mile, so a half mile on either end of the corridor. Well, let's zoom into Reynoldsburg, where there's some substantial opportunity, and stakeholders and the data showed that there was the capacity to put more there. And so you can look at some regional retail centers, strip centers, some vacant land, and you can look at a transformation of that from a land use perspective. So this is a one-story environment for the most part, moving to 3-, 4-, and 5-story environments. This is small lot, single family, townhome, multifamily residential development, modest increases in density for the most part, and mixed-use environments, walkable retail, jobs, et cetera. The details of this don't matter as much. What we wanted to do, though, is compare a snapshot. Let's take a look at that development in Reynoldsburg, and let's compare it to something just a mile or so away in a standard suburban location. Just the numbers in the middle are what important. On average, people in this new Reynoldsville sort of compact development, which is representative of the kind of growth that we're looking at occurring across the region in the corridors, they're within 2 minutes of a walk to retail services. People in the more standard suburban environment within 14-minute walk, right? So substantial differences there. Most of those walks on the right side are not occurring. Annual vehicle miles traveled, how much are we driving, right? Average person, average and per capita, driving in the Reynoldsburg mixed use, 4,100 versus 9,500 per year. That's emissions, that's costs, that's a lot of things. Much lower energy use per household. These are multifamily and townhomes. They're inherently more energy efficient. 2 to 1 almost difference in energy consumption. 5 to 1 difference in water consumption as you reduce the need for irrigated land. These are utility bills as well as resources. So what happens when you roll that up to the region? So we look at a scenario that is made up of, say, 60% new growth in those compact landforms, right? Things like that Reynoldsburg example. How does that roll up? Well, as you can expect with those corridors and very sort of substantial transit systems and focus around there, far more people have walk and transit access to jobs. In this case, almost 2 to 1 difference. So 262,000 people within a 45-minute transit or walk commute to their job. Far more utilization of a very substantial investment in transit. So up to 8% transit mode share along the corridors, 21% of trips being taken by walk. And this is with the most conservative assumptions about the transit infrastructure. So this assumes a bus rapid transit system, which is sort of the minimum needed investment for these corridors. But over time, as autonomous technology and other components enter the transit landscape, we would expect these numbers to go up dramatically and to see substantial decreases in auto use and substantial increases in other use. So look at the differences here. 8,500 miles per household per year in the corridor versus 17,000 in the current trajectory, which is just about what is driven today per year per household. That results in a substantial reduction in household costs, dominated by that transportation. So this is $8,500 less per year for households spending on transportation, utilities, and others. So this is a big part of the affordability equation. Affordability is not just about the price of the house. That's a big piece of it, of course. But you've got particularly families in poverty spending 50% of their household budgets on transportation. So this is a big piece of the household cost burden. This is, school, this is mortgage, this is rent, this is substantial. Substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions equal to 600,000 cars per year. Very substantial reductions in land consumption. So as we go compact, we're reducing land consumption by more than 100 square miles. That's mostly important agricultural, watershed lands, habitat lands, and other lands that are really critically important. And when you do that, not only are you having that sort of land consumption and environmental benefit and agricultural production benefit, but you're saving money. So it actually costs upwards of $10 billion less to serve that land pattern with capital infrastructure and to operate and maintain that over time. So these are the roads, the sewer, water, wet and dry utilities generally. It also costs less to supply emergency services. So you're looking at another $500 million. And then it also turns out that with higher preference and desirability around the transit orientation, around walkable communities, and around the intensification on the corridors, on a per square foot and per acre basis, very substantial increases in revenue as well. So, to the tune of about $1 billion over the planning period. So you're looking at reduction in cost and increases in revenue. So it's not just an environmental and household cost issue, it's also a substantial fiscal issue. We've got cities in California and across the country that are either on the verge of or have actually declared bankruptcy over the inability to operate it and maintain extended infrastructure that they built as their region spread out. And, it was one thing to build it. Developers helped pay for that. Cities were able to lay out the capital, but it's another thing to operate and maintain it over time. And so we've got substantial issues there. So all of this is in a very substantial report, all the details. We also break this down by every corridor and have a lot more details about the metrics. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And that, again, as has been noted, this is the beginning of a conversation. Just to close out my section here, I also need to point out that this is not obviously just about painting a couple rosy pictures or a rosy picture and a not so rosy picture and just saying, all right, let's do it. We got to roll up our sleeves and figure it out. To that end, a part of this project also involved the development of a framework or an implementation toolkit that doesn't specifically say, city, do this, but lays out ingredients or a framework, if you will, for the kinds of things, the kinds of incentives that have worked in other places or that could work here or that have worked in certain portions of the region so that we can address critical issues around affordability and workforce housing and look at the kinds of sort of zoning and other components that are absolutely going to need to be adjusted in order to accommodate the kind of growth if we're to get to something like 60% of growth on these corridors. So I'll stop there and look forward to a further conversation.
All right. I'd like to now introduce the other members of our panel. Steve Shoney is the Director of Development for the City of Columbus. He and his department are responsible for housing, code enforcement, economic development, land development, and planning for the city. Would you give it up for Steve Shoney? Next, we have Laura Kaprosky, Vice President of Government Affairs, Marketing, and Communications at CODA. And Joe, are you on the panel with us as well?
I guess so.
Yeah, I think so. I'm just going to stay up here. Is that cool, Zach? All right, I'm going to stay right here. So to the panel, and if you guys have questions from the audience, please tweet or text us so that we can make sure that your questions get answered. And to the panelists, feel free to answer any questions that are asked. Laura, this report shows the benefit of locating new housing and businesses near mass transit, but you can't locate housing and businesses near mass transit without fast, frequent, and reliable transit. How does CODA see the path forward with regard to mass transit?
Okay. Kind of testing out that microphone. Wow. So fast, frequent, reliable transit. So CODA's already been successfully underway achieving those three goals. So when you look at frequent, we have our transit system redesign that we launched in 2017. So we doubled the frequent routes. That means you have service available to you every 15 minutes, just like the C-Bus. You can go to one of those frequent transit route stops. You just stand there and you wait, and you just know within 10, 15 minutes, service is going to arrive. So check that box. As far as reliable, our latest customer service survey by our customers said 91% would recommend transit service to another friend, to a family member. So I would say, check that box. We're reliable. We're a good option. Now, when you get to fast and kind of more really take it to the next level, I think that is where this corridor concepts is so exciting and just what we need, because we haven't figured out how to make the COTA buses fly. Or hover. We haven't figured out how to take Hyperloop and, maybe connect it with COTA to fit it through a tube. So it's dedicated right away by all means. And so that conversation is really critical. Yeah. And I love how this concept, though, shows it that can't be in isolation. That really has to be integrated and part of the community, part of the fabric of development, part of the fabric of quality of life. So that's how I'd answer it. And if I can just take a moment, sitting here in this perspective, this used to be City Center Mall. And so I don't know, this is kind of a younger crowd. I don't know if any of you went to City Center Mall. But yeah, I was a student at Ohio University, and the big road trip was to come up here to City Center Mall. And this is just incredible to look out here as we talk about, what the future can be. And you don't see a mall, you see high density, and you see transit running around, and you see this building. So this is really inspiring, and what Joe presented is real.
Thank you, Lori.
Yeah.
And thank you for that perspective as well. That break for us to realize that we are doing some of these things along a high capacity corridor, which is High Street. Joe, earlier today we were talking about one of the issues with what we are trying to do is, or you talked about just now, crisis, waiting for the crisis. What we're trying to do is avert the crisis, and so solve a problem that may not be here yet. Are there any other cities that are using transit to solve their future growth issues or strategies, or even drive their growth patterns? Is anybody doing that well?
Yeah, there's a host of cities. No one's knocking it out of the park. I think maybe in Europe we see some of that, but I do think that there are some great success stories. I think one of the things I showed up on the screen it was the Portland Pearl District, and that was actually a piece of infrastructure that was put in place, kind of old school way to actually stimulate development in a specific district. So they actually built the infrastructure while they were building, housing and community. Housing and commercial development in that district, and that, sort of both the yin and the yang of the land use and transportation equation being built up at the same time very successfully. I think I would look to regions like Denver, which have put substantial resource and planning and execution on their dedicated right-of-way networks, so whether they be BRT, LRT, or the next generation of transit, who knows what it's going to be. And you've seen very substantial growth focus in and around the transit infrastructure. Those are a couple that I would look to. Vancouver in Canada has also done remarkable work. Montreal, where you're seeing real sort of dedication to accommodating very large portions of projected growth in and around new and planned transit infrastructure. One other thing I'll point out is you look at, for better or worse, the Amazon, the craze around where it was going to put its next campus, which hasn't worked that well. But one of the things that the Fortune 500 companies are now looking at are not just current transportation systems, but they're actually looking at future plans. Right, so they're saying like, okay, so we're going to be investing, potentially countless billions into a region. We need to think about the workforce that is there now, And we need to really think about whether this is a region that can sustain the kind of workforce that we need. So as they think about knowledge workers, right, and they think about being able to accommodate those, and they think about what knowledge workers need today and what they need in terms of, or what any region needs in terms of sort of fast, reliable, sustainable transportation, they're looking to places that have planned mobility corridors and rail transit routes and things like that. So I think this is and so those places that I mentioned, the Denvers, the Portlands, and the other places, are slated to outcompete for major sort of economic expansion as these companies grow. And I think this region is, because of the work that's being done here and the sort of forward-thinking nature of that, is slated to be very well positioned in that respect.
Steve, we talked about this yesterday. Joe's also used, I like the future-proofing Columbus. Is there a now issue? Like, you're our development director, so are we losing jobs now? Are we unable to get the next person, our next company to come here because of our current transportation or transit options or reliability, making things fast? Or what are those opportunities?
Yeah, a couple thoughts on that. I think, so yesterday we did a session with some members of the press, and I said something yesterday and it came out of my mouth. I was like, ooh, okay, I hope nobody actually picks that up. And of course, Columbus Underground picked it up. And I thought about it, and I thought maybe it was a little bit of an overstatement, but I said, our lack of a reliable system for companies to rely on for their most important input to their process. What's the most important input to Root's process? It's their team, it's their associates, it's their workforce. And so that's the fundamental element of their supply chain. And if they have a potential for an unreliable transportation system to manage their supply chain, then they're going to go somewhere else. And that's, to use an industrial business analogy to this, and I said yesterday, this is a clear and present danger. I think that's a little bit of an overstatement, but it is something we're being asked about. When we had Amazon come in, very thankful for all the attention. My life would be much more different right now if we were in Northern Virginia, and a lot different if we were in Brooklyn, given what happened. But the one thing that they focused on with us was how would we manage the workforce, and both from an affordability standpoint and from a transit standpoint. And because we were working on this, we had a great story to tell them, and we could answer the story about where we're going, and we could answer the story that we're not burdened by a legacy system. I think that's one of the advantages we have. But it's something we have to deal with. If we don't deal with it, it will become a true impediment. Right now, it's a question. If we don't deal with it, it will become an impediment.
And just to add on to that, the presentation also showed the future demographics are demanding this. So people don't really move a lot anymore for their jobs. And so they are going to places where they want to be, or they're staying in wonderful places like the Columbus region. And employers are coming here, they're growing, the companies. And so all I had to see were those demographics as well. And we're already having conversations. I mean, there's age-friendly Columbus. Suburbs are creating their own age-friendly. And those same people they also want great, reliable transportation options. They want the independence that it provides and the quality of life. So I think marrying up, there's really no way to turn away from what this study shows us.
And I think to Joe's point, and I love, what's the phrase you use, streetcar suburbs? Is that, thinking about that concept is fantastic, because it does get to what Laura's talking about. Really, our job is to create great places where people want to live. And having a functioning system where people have a choice about what mode they use. If you look around, even looking around Columbus with the systems that we have today, which are fairly limited, we all acknowledge that, those neighborhoods that present people with transportation choices are the neighborhoods that are succeeding. And that is how people are making their choices. They don't want to be locked into a car. They don't want to be locked into taking a bus or a subway, or a bike or walking. They want to be able to have those choices. And we have the opportunity to do that. I think the corridor study shows us the benefits of doing that.
Well, on my sheet it says, at this point I'm going to read a couple questions from the audience, but to Zach, my phone died, so when you come forward. Steve, we are, even though we're not at that crisis point yet around housing, it is still in a very, very important conversation for us in this region. How do we meld the affordable housing conversation that we're having right now with what this study tells us?
There's a couple ways in which they interplay. First of all, one of the things that kind of struck me when we looked at the study was the household savings from doing a focused growth pattern. Each household, when you look at the total cost profile, that's essentially the cost of living, each household on average is going to save $8,500 a year. I don't care what bond package we pass, we are not going to be able to provide $8,500 a household in subsidy to support lower rents for folks. It's never going to happen. There are savings that we can achieve through this that are real savings to real families that matter. When CODA did the CPAS program, it sounds like a great bus program, and it sounds like a great mobility program. To me, it's a great affordability program. For me, it struck me when I realized what we did with that is we gave every hospitality worker in the special improvement district a $1,000 a year raise, because that's the cost of a CODA bus pass over the course of a year. Now, the challenge with that is we have to do the right things with zoning and planning to make sure that that savings doesn't all get eaten up by increased land value. That's what the market will do with it if we don't do the right things with planning and zoning and start talking about things like inclusionary zoning. And those are the things that when you go out and talk to people in the neighborhoods, they care about. Everybody wants us to do good zoning, and everybody wants us to do good transit, and everybody wants us to do density, but they know we need to all do it together, because if we just do part of it, we'll screw it all up.
So a question from the audience, this probably is either for Steve or Joe. How should our region deal with parking for businesses as more road space is dedicated to transit, biking, and walking?
The short answer would be, as more road space is dedicated to transit, bike, and walking, and you see increasing mode shares to those other modes, there will be a substantial reduction in the need for parking. We talked about ownership to usership. People are ride sharing. If they take, the feared autonomous car and it's a zero occupancy vehicle and it just drives around and adds VMT, which is a whole other story, it also will not need a parking space. So I think we need to substantially rethink. You can't just flip a switch and turn off parking. This is a transition from where we are today to where we're going to be. And so over time, parking standards are already shifting. They're, around here, I'm sure it's shifted substantially to facilitate this kind of development. They're also a big part of the affordability equation. A structured parking space is somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000 per space. That dramatically increases the cost of construction, that increases the rent, that increases the lease amount, it increases the mortgage, and it has an outsized impact on affordability. So this combination of things is really a way to attack the affordability issue head on.
What he said. Plus, the challenge for us right now is in this transition period. So when we're in a competitive situation, we're looking at how do we attract jobs and how do we keep our companies viable. The cost of parking is a real problem. So the biggest thing for us is, I think over time as we make this progression, I think Joe's absolutely right. It's this interim period where the parking problem is a real problem. I joked around the office that we haven't had a meeting until somebody says parking. And whether we're talking about housing, whether we're talking about social services, whether we're talking about office development, it comes up in every meeting.
And I just have to say, it's got to be sooner than later that we really understand the value of the curb space. If we don't acknowledge that now, we're going to be behind. There have been some instances already where, look at some demonstration projects, and when you prioritize speed and you prioritize people being able to pull up to park right in front of a building, it really limits what is possible. It really doesn't allow what we're talking about to happen. And so I've heard, in New York City, really looking at the curb is the most valuable space for so many reasons because of mobility integration. That should be the $15 to $20 parking space, parking cost. Then the garages should be, $1 or $2 per hour. Sounds crazy, but I think really, that is what is starting to shift and turn. Uber and Lyft want to be at the curb. I mean, Kogo, our mobility hubs with Smart Columbus, we are totally undervaluing this. And then I also just think about how we just sort of disregard it as well. We just don't give it enough credence that it's really a valuable piece of our public infrastructure.
Paint them all red.
Paint them all red. This probably will be our last. We probably have 20 questions up here, so I think this is a pretty good one to kind of end on. It's kind of talking about how do we do this in an equitable way. But I think this question is from Walker Evans. He said, "What considerations should be taken at this early stage to make sure that everyone affected by changes in these corridors, largely people who are not in this room this evening, can have a seat at the table and can take part in the growth and prosperity and not get left behind and pushed out because of the changes?" And probably everyone could probably touch on that one.
First of all, amen. I mean, I think it is the fundamental question that we've got to struggle with. And, sometimes when we go through this process, we'll hear folks who say, well, we just need to come up with a plan, put the plan out there, and an expectation that by executive fiat, we can just make this happen and just impose this. And there really has to be a couple things. One is there has to be a real conversation with people in neighborhoods about what this is going to force the conversation for all of us about how do we see our city. And we have to take the time to have that conversation. There's having a sense of urgency, but still taking the time to do what's important. And I think that's a balance we're going to have to strike. So that's one way in which you incorporate the equity. The other way is, once you've had those conversations, being really serious about the tools that we use and how they impact the economics, because at the end of the day, it all comes down to money. We're talking about how much does it take to get someone to build a certain kind of building and rent that space to certain classes of groups. And you understand what the priorities are, you understand the economics, and then you put the tools in place. And I think we can come up with the tools. The tools exist. The question will be, do we take the time and be thoughtful enough with a sense of urgency to pull it all together and make it work? That was a lot of words for not a lot of specifics, and I apologize for that, but I think that's where we are.
I would say, this is a great start, and it's going to get better because the conversations will start in neighborhoods and with all people. Back to our transit system redesign, we got it about 90–95% right. And where we didn't get it right were places where people needed to get to Kroger, where people had to get to a doctor's office or a daycare. And we would just get out of the bus and walk the street with them, and we retooled it and we made it better. So I think this is a phenomenal start. I think it's going to just get to the next level with community engagement, absolutely.
I don't have too much more to add. I think those are all very, very good points and right on the money. It's one of the most complex issues is how do you actually sort of drive deeper engagement in these kinds of issues, which are so critical and they impact everybody's lives, but in many cases, the people that should have a seat at the table are too busy working 3 jobs. And so they can't be at this table. They don't have that luxury. So I think that is not I don't have a perfect solution for that, but it's something that has to be taken head on. What I look forward to is the ability to break past the sort of NIMBY versus YIMBY versus, he versus she versus shape of my community kind of, which mostly results in, some form of no. And for the ability to actually drive data into those discussions, drive answers as to the impacts. Like, how is this going to impact, heartstrings, pocketbooks? How does this actually affect my life, my kids' lives, my grandkids' lives? There is no one-size-fits-all for being able to deliver that across different types of folks, but I think that is one of the challenges that we collectively have as we look at substantial transformations in the shape of a region that has to benefit all, and a lot of people don't feel like they're going to be benefited, even though they might be, but we have to be able to figure out how to have that conversation.
Thank you. Will you give this panel a round of applause, please? At this point, I'm going to invite up Aaron Schill, Director of Data and Mapping at MORPC, to say a few words about what's next for this initiative.
All right, thank you. On behalf of MORPC, I want to first ask everyone to join me in thanking our partners for this, ULI, City of Columbus, and all the other communities that were partners in developing this study. It was a huge undertaking. This is a culmination of a year and a half of hard work by communities and residents that came out and provided us a lot of input. So let's say thank you to all of the partners. So this is a culmination of a lot of work, but I'm here to talk about next steps. So Joe, I'm hoping we got this right, because 8 a.m. this morning I closed on a house in one of the corridors. So when we're talking about implementation, we're not messing around at MORPC. We're getting on it. I will plead the fifth on that. So maybe a little more moderate approaches to next steps. We have 4 things we want to talk about for implementation that we are going to be working with communities on. I'm going to save the most important for last, but you're going to see the City of Columbus, CODA, and MORPC and others partnering on mobility innovation test projects over the next coming months. You're going to see a lot of things tried out and talked about. I think the CMAX program is a great example of that. The CPAS program is another great example of that. There's a lot of will and a lot of interest in testing out other mobility options. They're going to get us to serving these corridors and providing the transportation solutions that people need, and that we need to support the density in these corridors that we'd like to see. The second is that MORPC is going to be providing technical assistance to communities to implement and carry out what you see in the implementation framework that Joe referenced in his talk. So there's a lot of details in that. There's a lot of discussion of zoning changes and incentive packages, and we're going to be working with communities to make sure that they have the tools they need and the understanding to roll those out. The third next step is that we're going to be engaging in peer learning opportunities with other innovative communities across the country. So leaders from the City of Columbus and from other communities in our region are going to be partnering with peer communities across the country to learn from them and to share what we've learned and what we're doing to make sure that we're able to encourage the kind of development that we'd like to see, and to make sure that we are not falling into the same trap and trying to solve problems after they've already become crises here. And the last is the most important, like I said, and that's going to be continuing this conversation. So we'll be out in communities doing presentations, rolling this study out over the next several months. Us here at MORPC and other community partners are going to be looking to reach out to civic groups, to city councils, to anyone that wants to hear about this and help us get this message out and talk about how we can make these corridors and other corridors in our region a reality. We're interested in talking to you, so let us know, and we look forward to more conversation. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Council President Harden.
Thank you, Aaron. And I see Mr. William Murdoch, the executive director of MORPC here. Would you give him a round of applause for his leadership? I have a bit of housekeeping first. I want to thank Root again for hosting us. I want to thank Willoughby Soul Veg for providing the food. I want to thank CTV, Columbus TV, for filming this so that we can get this information out, and certainly to our panelists and all of you for being here. Quick housekeeping note, please clean up your way out. That was from Zach. Root was kind enough to let us use their space, so please help us out as we head out. In conclusion, Aaron talked about a couple of next steps. One of the things that you will hear me talking about a lot more throughout the region and working with Steve and CODA is dedicated right-of-way. It comes down to having the space for whatever the transit options are. The technology is going to change things, and it's going to make the conversation about what our Columbus's transit system looks like. We're going to be building this thing as we go. But one thing that we know for sure, and one thing that we know right now, is that we will need the physical space to do it and put it somewhere. And so from my standpoint, from City Council, we will be talking about dedicated right-of-way. See, you guys are the younger nerds. Like earlier today, I was with the older nerds. They didn't like it. You guys are the young.
That's a clear sign that you have too many planners in the room when you get cheers for dedicated right-of-way. That's a sign that there are too many planners here.
25 years of doing that. That is the first time I have seen that. That's awesome.
And so right out the gate, and Aaron alluded to this, CODA and the city are going to do mobility innovation tests. So you look to Boston if you want to see what we're going to try out, but we are going to test corridors. How if we move folks quicker, if we take a lane of traffic, turn it into bus only, can we move folks faster? How does it work when we change light systems to integrate with those? What types of what works best? You will see that in the early and the next 6 weeks, I would say. I when you say things, sometimes it helps it just happen quicker. So in the next 6 weeks. No, but seriously, we need everybody to be a part of this conversation. This is, again, not a year-long conversation. This is a decades-long conversation, and we need you guys to be a part of the advocacy for this. We need to spread out and to go into each one of our constituencies and start to socialize some of these terms around density, around right-of-way, around mobility as a way to be a great equalizer in our community. And so really, this is more of a challenge to each and every one of you. Let's stack hands and let's grow the right way. Thank you.